Uh, we have just about 40 minutes to talk about 3 decades, looking back and looking ahead. So it's a very difficult task, and I have very competent people to do that. And so I'll rely on them to make this journey as seamless as possible, because this is a journey we are looking at. We are looking at where Quad has come from and where it's likely to go, as we look at some of the challenges it has faced in the past, and the opportunities it has created for all four countries to navigate a turbulent world together. So first of all, welcome to all the panelists, Satu, Shruti, Yoshida-san, and Alexandra. And I'll just begin by stating the obvious, that it has been a very, very interesting trajectory. If you go back to this idea, as was enunciated in the inaugural interventions, 2007 was the time when we first heard of this kind of a grouping. And then suddenly dissipated for various reasons. And then 2017, it was resurrected. So it has been a journey which has been very interesting, with its ups and downs, with its challenges, and the robustness with which it has bounced back, I think, tells us the need for it and the space that it has created for itself in the tapestry of various kinds of institutional frameworks that are now emerging in what we call as the Indo-Pacific. So I think the Japanese ambassador talked about the role that Shinzo Abe, former Japanese Prime Minister, played, not only in the articulation of the need for looking at Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans as one contiguous maritime zone, but also the need for a certain kind of an architecture to support that geographical innovation. So let me just go to Yoshida-san and start, sir, with you from a Japanese perspective, because as we have heard how critical Japan has been in shaping our thinking about this institution, this platform. How do you assess, sitting from Tokyo, the journey that Quad has managed to traverse? And also, where do you think, or where do you think the new opportunities lie as you look at the next few decades of its evolution?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Pant. Yes, the quote originated from the response to the 2004 tsunami of the coast of Sumatra. And at that time, the four countries joined exercise, mobilized their maritime forces for provide humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. However, first half of this 20 years of the Quad, a little bit long period of stagnation. I think this is from the various backgrounds of each respective country. But I can dare to say that the main background behind this is something diplomatic and political consideration vis-a-vis China. At that time, over the 10 years ago, we expected the China will be very good strategic stakeholder in the region. But as a result of the Xi Jinping's administration, the China started to make their strong assertiveness to try to change the status quo in the region, and also try to change that situation with the use of force. For example, in the South China Sea, Eastern Sea, and the borders with India. The group was first officially designated as Quad the last half of this decade. And probably it was initiated as a Quad in 2017. And this is 1 year after the vision of FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, was announced. So I can dare to say there is no wonder the Quad is closely linked with the concept and the principle of FOIP. At that time, it was labeled as encirclement network against China. But our thinking, our thought is not the one against China. If China comes to join us to pursue the principle of rule-based international order, then we can welcome them. But for it cannot be achieved, the concept of FOIP cannot be pursued by the 4 countries of Quad alone. So we need partners of the like-minded countries, particularly the countries in ASEAN or in the Pacific. They are located at a very strategic juncture, geopolitical juncture, between the 2 big oceans. Therefore, in order to extend our partnership of these countries, we should better not to provoke China. And that would be counterproductive. Therefore, the Quad evolved based upon non-military sense of cooperation and expanded its scope to the wide range of outstanding agendas, which was mentioned earlier by initial remarks. I do not reiterate. And also, the unique nature of the Quad is this is not a legally binding treaty-based international institution. Rather than that, it's quite flexible. We can select the partners, countries, based upon the specific agenda. And also, this is the kind of the amalgam of the unilateral, trilateral, bilateral, and in totality, the Quad can pursue our vision. Therefore, we needed to continue to keep this flexible nature of the Quad. But at the same time, I'd like to stress that we have to come back our original vision, that is the pursuit of the free and open Indo-Pacific. This is going to be the things to prevent the unilateral use of force for change the status quo. Then we had better to stress or to focus upon more security-related agenda. Thank you.
Yoshida-san, if I can sort of take that argument and forward. You mentioned 2 things, which is the inherent flexibility of this idea also has given rise to a lot of other minilaterals and plurilaterals that we have seen. So I think there is a now discourse from multilateralism to minilateralism, and I think Quad has been at the heart of this conversation. But you also mentioned subsequently that you would like to the Quad to come back to its original idea and focus on the free and open Indo-Pacific notion and strengthening the security architecture. Do you see a dissonance there in the sense that do you then believe that there should be greater institutionalization of the Quad, even in the security realm, or at the moment, given the pace and where we are coming from with different sets of notions about our, as you mentioned, different notions of alliance and treaty arrangements, from a Japanese perspective, are you comfortable with the pace of the evolution? That's what we are interested in this session, the journey. Do you anticipate when you say greater institutionalization, do you anticipate a greater formalization of the Quad? Yes.
Well, thank you very much. The Quad evolution is based upon quite flexible, the accumulation of the multi-layer of the bilateral, unilateral, and the plurilateral, and this kind of a flexible nature should be kept. we do not have to necessarily institutionalize in a sense that set up their treaties or the international agreements, but at the same time, the Quad should be navigated by the initiative of the leaders. And there are many working groups set up under the leaders meeting, the foreign ministers meeting. We should keep on going on that. But at the same time, somehow the original vision of the Quad was a little bit diluted due to the widening the scope of the activities. So the resources should be more allocated on the type of the security-related issues such as maritime domain awareness, cyber security, but they are not necessarily military-based agenda.
Thank you. Satu, if I can now come to the US side of the equation, and it has been, of course, America is central to the evolution of the Quad. I was wondering, there has been this interesting, the evolution of the Quad has been very interesting from an American perspective because we have had two different administrations. The Trump administration laying the foundations, and then Biden administration really building on it. So given the fragmentation in the US polity, this seems to have been one of the few areas of convergence, at least on the global stage, that we have seen from two very different administrations. First of all, what do you attribute this convergence to? And given the dissonance today in the American politics, are there reasons to be worried about the future?
Well, thank you for the questions, Harsh. Good morning to everyone, and thank you again for the invitation. And East West Center is, of course, delighted to participate in this think tank program. And I'm very delighted also to say that Harsh and Observer Research Foundation and the East West Center will be doing a report on the Quad to be released later this year. Look, I think there are 3 or 4 points I'd come to, bottom lines up front. First, the Quad reflects, I think, in the US system, 3 or 4 key things. First, it came from an accident, went into a period of ad hocism, and now is something of a strategy. So bottom line 1 is that this came inadvertently, unplanned, but now I think it's a strategy that will stick. Second, I think it's really important to note that the Quad offers a particular way of bridging 2 tendencies in American foreign security policy life. One is the doubling down on alliances and building new partnerships with commitment to multilateralism. What the Quad allows us to do, quite frankly, is to double down on our alliances with Australia and Japan in fundamental ways, while helping to bridge and facilitate further linkages between Japan and Australia on the one hand, between us and our Indian colleagues, of course, on the other, and India with the other partners. So in other words, that jostling between alliance, what used to be called hubs and spokes, and then move to webs of relationships, I would now call what I call in an upcoming piece, from wheels to webs to wires. And the Quad is now a part of a wiring system of trusted allies and partners. So that's second. The third point of this, and this answers your question, I assure you, about our politics, but I don't want to front load that sensitive issue. The third point I'd make is that this reflects a fundamental shift in American thinking about China. And I mean, I know it might sound sort of cobweb history here, but there was a time when China was not a driver of this issue, was not a particularly aligned area amongst these 4 partners. Was certainly an insufficient driver from roughly 2007 to, let's call it, 2014-ish. You could pick your date. But I think China's actions, and I think someone said at the conference at Raisina, I thought the phrase was good, that the Quad is made in Beijing. But I think alliance shoring up that's happened has also been attributable to China's actions and behaviors, as our colleague from Japan has said. So three things have happened. Our shift on China has, because of Chinese actions and the prioritization, has been accompanied by attitudes of alignment amongst the four in a way that have not existed in the previous 3 decades. So what's it likely to be in 2034? I think the PRC will remain a key driver, and I think we will not have as, I can say almost anything about 10 years out. I don't think it'll be maybe intense strategic competition, but I would call it sticky strategic competition. That strategic competition is going to stick in fundamental ways, and it's not going away anytime soon. But we'll have to work hard amongst the Quad members to keep the alignment level high. And the final thing I'd say, which comes down to the issue of the US approach, is the Indo-Pacific priority. Also something historical, maybe, things come and go in countries, but I can remember a time as late as, 2001, as early as 2001, when we were trying to make a shift to the Indo-Pacific in our quadrennial defense review. The public version of that document was issued on the 10th of September. On the 11th of September 2001, the quadrennial defense review was not a particularly useful guide to the world that we faced. And I only mention that because I think the focus on the Indo-Pacific is here to stay, and I want to make that point specifically because we've heard so much about the Middle East and Ukraine. I want to just emphasize the United States can do many things simultaneously, and we can remain quite engaged and active in the Indo-Pacific, regardless of very real and important issues to be faced in Central Europe and Middle East. So I just conclude by saying, what does that mean for the politics? What it means is these drivers, to me, are structural rather than personnel. We'll hear later from Kurt Campbell, and certainly wouldn't put words in his mouth, but I think that regardless of the administration that's in Washington, there is consensus on these fundamental drivers, and therefore these fundamental drivers will continue to animate our commitment and our intentionality towards the Quad.
Satu, if one can take that forward and just look at the institutional question, what kind of an institutional framework, is there a consensus on that as well, that this loose ad hoc approach to institution building in the Indo-Pacific, as Quad represents, is something that would continue, or that's something that would persist, and that there is enough of a consensus on that in the American polity that that's the best way going forward? Have we come to terms with that? Because in the past, this has been a bone of contention for many, that look, we want a stronger institution of a certain kind because of our historical engagement with what traditional institutions should look like. So as we look at the trajectory, a decade down the line, do you see that becoming a point of contention, or there is enough comfort level now with this idea of a loose ad hoc coalition?
Yeah, fair enough. As with my previous answer, can I get to institutionalization because it rides on the back of 3 or 4 other factors? I think there are really 4 or 5 issues confronting us now. Given what I laid out, I hope convincingly is a case for American commitment for the reasons I outlined. One is the level of securitization of Quad. The second is the level of operationalization of the Quad. I will say up front here, I have some concerns about the diffusion of the agenda. Our wonderful colleagues who are practitioners have spoken to the various elements that have been added on. But I'm a little bit of the mindset that we ought to be careful about laying on too many responsibilities and burdens on Quad without meeting some fundamental public goods in a very dramatic and sustainable way. So I'm not suggesting that we don't do these things. I want to be very clear. What I'm suggesting is delivery is going to matter. And sustainable delivery is going to matter more. And the final thing is integration, and I'll come back to your institutionalization question, because these lead into the institutionalization question. We have 2 sets of integration problems, I think, in Quad. One is integration amongst the Quad members so that we're aligned on capabilities and approaches. I take very seriously, I believe it was Ambassador Suzuki who spoke to, or perhaps it was High Commissioner Green, who spoke to complementarity approaches rather than necessarily joint approaches. That's fine. But our systems are extraordinarily different. They're quite asymmetrical in resource spaces and other things, and therefore it's really important that the integration amongst Quad members be firm and institutionalized before we can institutionalize delivery through Quad. And integration must be done through, as was mentioned earlier, through ASEAN PIF and IORA in the future. Now, I think we have, my personal view, again, we were enjoined to be a little bit off message in terms of, since we're not officials. I am mindful that IORA, ASEAN, and PIF have other institutions, including their own. We have partners of the Blue Pacific, we have PIF, IORA, and other ASEAN vehicles. So I'm not, I know there's a whole panel on this, I'm not moved that that needs to be institutionalized to work with those, Quad needs to be institutionalized to work with those institutions. There's three problems on institutional on the US part, despite the intentionality and commitment. One, a steady earmarked set of funding lines for Quad activities. Can that be implemented through NDAA? I leave it to others who can speak about this. I don't see that funding line coming. And unless there is a funding line, we can talk about all the institutionalization we want, but if you don't have money to back institutions, it ain't gonna happen. Two, you're gonna have to have personnel committed to the Quad effort in a bureaucratic setup, and we don't. We have people working on it, fabulous people working on it, colleagues of mine, friends of mine, but we don't have a systemic institutionalization of Quad. I don't know about the other parties, I won't speak to other countries, but certainly we don't. So I think that's important. And I think the final thing about institutionalization is that when you have 5 leaders meetings in 26 months for an institution that is roughly 19 years old, I always like to think about Quad, here's the 20th year, but it's a young adult. And if you can get leaders to come to 5 meetings in 26 months, you're driving a certain kind of pathway already. So I'm not a big proponent of a new building which says Quad headquarters of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. But I think we have to be mindful of the money lines, the personnel lines, and the bureaucratic setup.
Fair points, and I think we can come to some of them later in the discussion. Alexandra, Australia. When we started this journey long back, Australia, along with India, were two of the more tentative members of the Quad, and in fact, the reasons why the first iteration could not move forward was because there was a domestic political, very vibrant debate in Australia about how far should we go with a platform like this. Are you confident from an Australian perspective that we have traversed that distance, that the dissonance is no longer there, and the future trajectory is going to be relatively seamless as far as Quad is concerned, enough of a consensus within the Australian political mainstream about both in terms of what we have learned from the past and how we can move to the future?
Thanks, Harsh. I'll keep my comments brief. You can hear my voice. It's probably not particularly good out there, so I apologise for that. Yes, so look, 2007, 2008, it was clear that not every member of the now Quad was on the same page. They were not strategically aligned on various issues, including China, of course. CT at that time was really, counter-terrorism was really the issue that was binding these nations together. And every country was negotiating essentially its own complex relationship with China and the various economic drivers that attached to that. For Australia at that time, the economic agenda was probably driving much of the political decision-making and our calculations around national interest. The pursuit of a free trade agreement was obviously top of mind. Fast forward sort of 7-8 years now, a couple of events in quick succession. In 2015, we had the China lease of the Port of Darwin. In 2016, we had the South China Sea ruling, and in 2017, 2018, we obviously had the review into Huawei's involvement into Australia's 5G networks. A succession of those kinds of events, coupled with various cyber attacks over the course of that same time period, I think really led to an awakening in the Australian system of the need to perhaps think a little bit more carefully about where our national interest lay, what national security meant, and how we needed to potentially balance growing Chinese influence in the region and, of course, in our own sovereign decision-making. So I think it's fair to say that Australia is absolutely on board with the Quad as it now stands. Two things that we really want from the Quad, of course, is that strategic balance with China. And effectively, the other thing that we need to do is to promote that open Indo-Pacific region, to give states in this region essentially the freedom of action and freedom of choice that we would hope to exercise ourselves.
So the question that I'd also raised with both our colleagues from the US and Japan, in terms of the future evolution of this platform, would you, from an Australian perspective, prefer a greater degree of institutionalization of this effort? And given your work on cyber and tech, because that has now become the focus of, in some ways, I think High Commissioner was talking about how tech is driving the agenda. And Satu's remarks about not making this too diverse of an agenda. Where do you stand on this question? I mean, should we be more focused, and do you want greater institutionalization of this platform?
I do think that the Quad is at a bit of a turning point. We've overcome a number of the obstacles of the previous iterations of the Quad, which is to say, we've established a cadence, we've set up the working groups and a forward agenda in a way that we hadn't done previously. We've articulated what the Quad is not, so it's not Asian NATO. We've reasserted the centrality of ASEAN. All of the kinds of, ambiguities that were swirling around the 2007-2008 iteration of the Quad, and perhaps even in early 2017, we've addressed many of those, and I think that's an excellent progress. What we have done, though, I think
they're having difficulty,
is articulated a forward program and a vision for the Indo-Pacific that is a good one, but an enormous one. It's climate change, it's cyber, it's critical and emerging technologies, and essentially we are going to at some point need to make a choice about that. That vision is essentially huge. Quad by its nature is not set up for delivery. It is a free-flowing, loosely institutionalised agreement and arrangement. And that means no secretariat. That means that you do not have necessarily a front door for industry. That means that you don't necessarily have working groups. I think, as you've mentioned, we do have working groups thinking about all of these issues, but not necessarily in a position to easily marshal resources and to engage in long-term program delivery. And that, I think, is really where we need to get down to a choice, effectively. Either the Quad spins out all of its projects in a way that it in fact has done, in part. There are a number of projects that are out there, Indus X, for example, a series of defence and security cooperation agreements that, whilst you wouldn't say they had sprung from the Quad, obviously have been part and parcel of the conversations that have been nurtured through the Quad over the course of the past 4 or 5 years particularly. And so from that point of view, I think the Quad has to decide, do I spin out all of our projects to other bodies? And that's kind of what's happening now, and we need to just articulate that that's what's going to happen, and that the Quad remains a loosely institutionalised version as we have now. Or do we say, actually, the Quad needs to do delivery as well, and we articulate that, in which case I think I'm very much in agreement. We need to narrow right down to a couple of very key achievable things. You know, a large number of ideas for discussion, of course, but a small and clear set of ideas for delivery. And that is a question that I think is with us for the next 5 years out to 2030. So if I had my take on it. Obviously, Harsh, you've asked about critical and emerging technologies. I think we need to be for something, not just against China, and as Prime Minister Modi has said, and by that I mean we need to continue to develop programs that speak to regional needs and benefit the region more broadly. So if I had my choice, that would be energy delivery, that would be digital connectivity, and that would be digital connectivity not necessarily in terms of poles and wires, but it would be that kind of last mile connectivity, and it would be undersea cable connectivity. It would be looking for the gaps where we're not actually competing against China's mega projects. It would be looking for where we can actually add value and continue to stimulate growth, access and choice. And I think the other thing that I would look at would be digital public infrastructure, but I would make sure that that digital public infrastructure had the right kind of layers of cybersecurity around it to ensure that it functioned in the way that we would want it to.
Thank you, Alexandra. And those of you who are wondering that we are touching upon a number of subjects, we have two panels who will be looking specifically at the Indo-Pacific and technology side. So there'll be time to delve deeper into it. The aim of this particular session is to look at the journey that Quad has traversed over the last 2 decades and where it is going. Last but not the least, Shruti. India, and I have always said that it's India that makes Quad interesting. We know that US is a traditional alliance partner of Japan and Australia, so it's India's ability to pitch in, India's desire to be part of such an arrangement, and we know the journey India has traveled in terms of understanding and incorporating these ideas, not always averse to treaty alliances, but then like-minded partnerships becoming the norm in India's foreign policy. So from an Indian point of view, when you look at this journey, are you comfortable that this is sustainable, that we have achieved enough in our domestic political and strategic community debates and discourse, that we have reached a point where where we are comfortably positioned with Quad, and that the future evolution of the Quad would be in sync with our own requirements and with our own space that we have in shaping a foreign policy imagination?
Thanks very much, Harsh. Let me begin by thanking the MEA, the ORF, Samir, for this opportunity. Your Excellencies, it's very great to be here among all of you. And also a special shout out to my boss, Ambassador Chinoy, who's come here to support me. No pressure. So, but just to
and he can ask a tough question. So
he does that anyway at work. So we are well-oiled machinery. But very quickly coming back, I think for me the story of India in the Quad is one of in the public narrative being called the weakest link in the Quad, to now taking ownership of the Quad process in terms of, Additional Secretary Rao talking about mainstreaming of the Quad and its concepts in how we think of the conceptualization of regional architecture. If you look back, Prime Minister Modi's comments about the Quad as a force of good, or even, just a week or two back when Foreign Minister Jaishankar was at Perth, he spoke very optimistically about the future of the Quad, saying it's going to have a very large imprint on regional politics as also global politics. So I think in terms of what I look at premise and promise of the Quad from New Delhi's point of view, I think with what we've seen with the cycle of birth, burial, if you will, and resurrection of the Quad, I think India's interests and what it sees as opportunity is here to stay. But having said that, it's like you said, it's not been easy. I think Dr. Jaishankar has often pointed out that, this was not something that was predestined, but it has happened because we've sort of overcome confined, traditional confines and set working habits. And as High Commissioner Green pointed out earlier, that, it's all about leveraging collective strengths. Now, it's also, if you're looking at how India views it, Quad is key to our national interests. What we've been able to do with the Quad process is to anchor how we see bilateral, trilateral, and maybe multilateral agendas dovetail with a lot of what we do back at home. And the necessity for this was seen when, you have so many panels at Raisina discussing the inability of international government structures to be able to reform. And so, therefore, the case for the Quad becomes sort of stronger. Also, in terms of just the exposure over the couple of iterations, now we have working groups over various sectors, as was mentioned in the opening remarks. You have bureaucracies, militaries, your industry, technology ecosystems talking to each other so much that the so-called habits of cooperation actually being reinforced, whether you like it or not. So I think in terms of how that's going to go forward, that's quite an indicator. But most importantly, like I mentioned, for Prime Minister Modi, the process of the Quad is a force of good. So, like you, sir, mentioned about, tangible good, and the fact that where it's going to be inclusive is obviously of strategic importance to India. But I think if you go around telling countries that, you have binary choices, it's this or that, without viable alternatives, as has been pointed out many times in this discussion, it's not going to fly. The very fact that you've seen a length and breadth of activities doing so, I think is testament to in keeping with India's interests in the Quad. Having said that, at the G20, we were able to see how you can leverage partnerships to sort of scale up local templates to sort of a global platform. We saw that with the Digital Public Infrastructure Initiative, a lot of the stuff that's happening on climate action. So I think this bolstering of capabilities will also keep India interested in moving this platform forward. When we're talking about, things like standards and principles, it's already been mentioned. But when you're talking about setting standard operating procedures for critical tech, cyber security, connectivity, ORAN, as one of the excellencies mentioned, what you're doing is telling a region which original default was sort of templates from China, that now you have an alternative. And I think there's value in that. And finally, I think, there's always this debate around security and institutionalization of the Quad. I think I was very struck by comments made by sort of Andrew Schreier, the head of national intelligence from Australia, when he said what has happened in the past is that you've been caught up in binaries of at peace and at war when you think of security. And when you're talking about informal wars, it's a lot about perpetual struggle and how do you adapt and deal with it. India, of course, has had, if you will, experience on dealing with that sort of gray zone state of wars. But what I think is this ability of the grouping to come together to adapt to those kind of challenges. So when you see, for example, not just in terms of how militaries work in Malabar or, interoperability to deal with HADR and other such activities together, but how you imagine cooperation in terms of working with countries on the socialization of the UNCLOS, for example, or via India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, where, we have a lot of our partner countries taking ownership of particular pillars of bolstering maritime governance, whether it's IUU fishing, you mentioned maritime domain awareness, you're securing undersea cables, and a lot of it is about tackling disinformation. So I think you see a lot of these concerns taken care of. So that's the good news. But of course, if you're going to talk about the future, you also have to talk about the challenges. And this sort of picks up from some of what my panelists have been talking about. I mean, shared concerns may not always add up to alignment of priorities. As many people put it, that like-minded doesn't always translate to same-minded. So, we have to sort of be cognizant of that. And I think something very important that came up in the Raisina discussions was about, let's not only talk about Black Swan, but also talk about beware of the new normal. So this expectation of overpromise and under-delivery is something that we'll have to be cognizant about.
Thank you, Shruti. And I've been a very bad moderator, so I have not had time to involve you in the discussion. I'm sorry for that. But all of these 4 speakers are around, so catch them and also raise some of these questions in your subsequent sessions where others can answer the questions that they are supposed to answer. So thank you. Over to you, Shruti.
Thank you so much, Professor Pant. We do come to the close of the first session.